Hey dolls! So I've recently been watching a lot of analysis / fan theory essays on Fumito Ueda's Shadow of the Colossus, and as interesting as their takes on the games are, there is a large tendency to miss the forest for the trees with this one. I've been working on the script for too long, so I'll be splitting it into two parts. Part 1 will consist on my own analysis on the game, and Part 2 will cover more in depth on where the fanbase tends to, well, go off the deep end. Now, this video is for those who have played or viewed all of Shadow of the Colossus, so spoilers are everywhere. I recommend playing it though. I know that isn't possible for everyone, but seriously, it's an important game that has influenced many developers behind your favorite titles. Why do I think this game is frequently misunderstood? One day, I was watching YouTube and videos that went in depth on Shadow of the Colossus. There are the fairly normal ones talking about the moral ambiguity of the game, because it is one of the early examples of a game narrative where our actions as the protagonist is pretty questionable. Then I started to get recommendations where the content creators were engaging in more fan fiction than actual analysis. I came across YouTuber Jacob Geller's video on a faction of the Shadow of the Colossus fanbase known as the Secret Seekers. The Secret Seekers were people on a message board who insisted there was something hidden that Ueda wanted players to find. They believed that the secret would reveal something. I don't know what they expected to find, and I doubt they did either. Despite that people have data mined, hacked, scoured the entire game in just about every iteration, people are still determined there is a secret to be found. And spoilers? No, there's nothing hidden. When Bluepoint Games did the PlayStation 4 remake, they even built in a collect 'em all quest in honor of this part of the fanbase. You collect 79 enlightenments, where you would unlock a brand new sword that just wasn't really worth the effort, in my opinion. Son of a bitch. Shortly after the game was released in Japan, the official art book, which is really more of a guidebook with developer insights, was released in early 2006. Unfortunately, only those who could read and understand Japanese could enjoy it, until 5 years later when Arya Tanner, better known as Glitterberry, translated all the story information and developer interviews. I and many other fans appreciate the hard work she placed in this. While I own a physical copy of the art book, I am pulling the translations from her website. I find this book to contain the most fascinating insight on the game, as it was all done prior to the public getting their hands on the final product. Thus, I consider the developers' comments in here to hold a raw truth that I just never saw repeated in the many interviews Ueda has done since. I will talk more about the fanbase in the second part and just present a different perspective on Shadow of the Colossus here. But before that, I would like to start with what's the game's point of origin for me. How I first learned about Shadow of the Colossus, or Wanda to Kyozo, which translates to Wonder and the Colossus as it is known in Japan. I was bored in the summer of 2005 and flipping through channels when I checked out G4, which was advertised as a gamer television network, but I never watched it until that day. E3 was going on, and I landed on Adam Sessler and Morgan Webb, hosts of X-Play at the time, talking about the game showcased they were most excited for. One of those games was Shadow of the Colossus. What stood out to me was that they mentioned it was made by the team behind Ico. Now, I had yet to play Ico, but I remembered reading about it in a Game Informer magazine when it first came out on the PlayStation 2. The article praised it, and the screenshots looked gorgeous. I wanted to play it for a long time, but when I would see it on store shelves... well, you don't entirely blame me, right? I would eventually play Ico. It was unlike anything I had played at the time, and still is an extremely unique title. It was very beautiful, with a nice and simple story told in scarce cinema scenes, as well as in gameplay sequences. Something that is still rare in games 20 years later. Ico really came out 20 years ago, huh? Shadow of the Colossus came out sooner than I realized when I went into what was still known as EB Games and saw it on the new releases shelf. I wouldn't be paid for my part-time job until the following week, but an employee of the store handed me a demo. The demo was just the fight against the first Colossus. With the hints that a mysterious voice told me, I managed to topple the giant. As I was heading back to my horse, this moment happened. And it occurred to me that something's very wrong here. I mean, it was a true shock. Usually defeating a boss was a good thing in games, and, well, that couldn't have been what happened. I mean, I was already interested in the game, but now I was sold, and I had to see what happens after the demo. So I shortly bought it, played it, and loved it. Oh my gosh. Most video essays focus on the moral conundrum of Shadow of the Colossus, that the truly questionable and evil action we take is defeating the Colossus because they were innocent living creatures, chilling in the Forbidden Lands. I hear many players state they found themselves not wanting to kill the Colossus, and they felt remorseful when each one fell. The Colossus were just sitting around, harming no one, and we have to kill them at the behest of some ominous voice? When you stab a Colossus, does it not bleed? Does it not cry out when it feels pain? I know some players think they can even feel emotions, as the 11th Colossus does seem to show fear. And there's some players who also see this moment of the 16th Colossus, who we first are introduced to as something really ominous and filled with rage. But there's nuance when it sees you on its hand. Although, kind of looking at this, I think it's a bit more like... The player can only take on the Colossus in a specific order, despite being able to reach all except the final Colossus at the start of the game. You cannot fight them until you've defeated the Colossus prior to it. If you go to a Colossus before you are supposed to fight them, you'll see that nothing is there. Guess they aren't just chilling, huh? I kid. This footage you're seeing is of the remake, but I'm sure this was done in the original version as a means of saving memory, and Blue Point Games stayed true to this. In terms of narrative, I believe we should consider each Colossus remaining idle in the locations we do fight them in. The work around the design limitations was to have the player fight them in a specific order, so only one Colossus will be enabled in the game at a time. In an interview with Shmuplations, Ueda started with a theme of Zankokse, which in English can mean barbarism, savagery, inhumanity, or cruelty. The translator of this interview went with the word cruelty, so I'll stick with that choice for the time being. This was a concept in his mind when the game was under the working title as Nico. After completing Ico, people would ask him about Grand Theft Auto 3, a controversial game at the time for its graphic violence and encouraging the player to commit crimes in the game. Yeah, after I made Ico, I was often asked what I thought of Grand Theft Auto 3 in overseas interviews. I see, Grand Theft Auto and Ico must have seemed like polar opposites. Yeah, although I had bought a copy of Grand Theft Auto 3 for myself and liked it. And I've played them since the first Grand Theft Auto, so it was interesting to me to see people view Ico like that. I've never thought that cruelty is something forbidden in video games. Video games seem to require cruelty as a means of expression, and that being the case, I wanted to try and present my own take on cruelty. That was really the seed idea of Shadow of the Colossus. In the art book, there are interviews from the developers, and this is also touched upon by Ueda and Kenji Kaido, the project manager on the game. They were asked the question when they felt at what point that it was a game that came from the heart. For me, it would have to be when I lost the impression that the Colossus were moving according to obvious AI algorithms. I felt it all of a sudden one day while I was testing the gameplay. The Colossus didn't feel alive, and they didn't feel like animals, but they weren't machines either. That felt right to me. If you think of the Colossus as living beings, you might feel kind of sorry for them. You could say the game becomes too graphic. I try to make the game abstract, so you wouldn't know whether the Colossus were structures or animals in order to ensure it wasn't cruel and unusual. While many think pieces on the game go on about how the developers' intentions were to have us feel terrible for killing the Colossus because senseless murder is wrong, while the true intentions were actually more ambiguous and largely left to the player to determine how to view the Colossus. I, unlike many other players, never once felt a sense of guilt for killing the Colossus. I do not see them as living creatures in the same sense as a person or a skink. I view the Colossus more as automatons. An automaton is given a directive to carry out, and that is their sole purpose. In this case, prevent the release of Dorming's power at all costs. The Colossus don't come to life until you approach them and would likely have remained dormant if you didn't carry the one weapon that can destroy their purpose. We see in several cutscenes the Colossus go from their dormant state to an active one. Their bodies appear as if they were sculpted, with features found more commonly among architecture. Wander is able to grip onto these features, as well as what appears to be fur sprouting from bare spots of the Colossus. Although, could what resembles fur also be simply dry grass? The 12th Colossus has plants sprouting from its body as if residing in a dam has provided the grass on their body proper nutrition. The truth is, according to Ueda, what Wander holds on to is actually a combination of fur and moss. Upon the defeat of the Colossus, you can later venture to where you bested them and find the remains where their bodies have become one with the earth, as if they were nothing more than a crumbled structure. But if one can interpret the Colossus as non-living beings, then wherein lies the theme of Zankokse Ueda mentioned? I pointed out the other interpretations of Zankokse because it has layers that become lost in translation. Cruelty is a wonderful way to describe it, but I think inhumanity and savagery are also at heart. I believe that is best shown to us when we turn our focus away from the Colossus and onto the characters. We can infer that Dorming was a being that at one point in time was worshipped, but something happened that they were defiled, their body and power scattered among the Colossus, and the forbidden lands that contained them was abandoned by the rest of the world. We are never privy through any information found in the game as to why this has happened. The art book only states that Dorming is a being with a power beyond human knowledge, and they did a forbidden act. No other information is provided, but the narrative leaves clues that it is the knowledge to restore a soul from the afterlife. I'll talk a bit more about this in the next part, but here's where I'm going to be like a lot of fans and overanalyze the narrative a bit. I use restoring a soul over reviving the dead, largely due to the dialogue presented. It's interesting that the bargain is to restore Mono's soul rather than bring her back to life. Another thing, it seems that it took a lot of time for Wander to arrive to the Forbidden Lands, and we see that Aemon and his men, who weren't too far behind, well, they don't catch up to him until the last Colossus falls. However, when we see Mono first placed on the altar in the Shrine of Worship, her body shows no signs of decay, almost as if she is still alive, but hollow of any spirit, leaving her in a death-like sleep. Now, the actual reason is that the designers did not want to be true to reality, and instead went with a more fairy tale death for Mono, not too dissimilar from Snow White or Sleeping Beauty. Ueda wanted the player to feel an attachment to Mono, much like Wander does, and well, that would be extremely difficult if she truly looked like a decomposing corpse. But when replaying the game to record footage, that phrasing stuck out to me that I wanted to mention it briefly. Mono's soul was sacrificed as it was believed she held a cursed fate. There's no confirmation anywhere to my knowledge on what this fate is, but I have always theorized that it was to become the mother of an accursed lineage. It's clear that Wander opposed her sacrifice, as we shortly learn that the lands he steps on are forbidden by his people, and even the request humors Dorming as it goes against the laws of mortals. Wander is willing to risk everything, willing to break what is the biggest taboo among his people, perhaps humankind, just to bring Mono back. Dorming as they are presently is too weak to bring back her soul, but since our hero has the ancient sword, the two strike up a bargain. With your sword, release our power from the Colossus, and we will restore her soul. It should be important to note that Dormin does warn Wander of a great cost to this deal, but Wander cares for nothing other than the return of his beloved. I mentioned earlier my initial reaction when playing the demo and defeating the first Colossus. I realized as the bands pierced Wander that there is more than just a typical boss fight, as in most games. I didn't catch on to Wander's change in appearance until fighting the 15th Colossus. I noticed how much paler his skin tone was, and the dark marks on his face didn't look like dirt. It occurred to me that Wander was changing as the game progressed, and it wasn't for the better. After the defeat of every 4 Colossus, we have seen Wander's appearance slowly transform. It starts off with just worn clothing, his body covered in dirt and scrapes, nothing unusual for a man on a physically exhausting quest. Shortly after defeating the 8th Colossus, the effects of taking in the dark tendrils are growing more visible. Well, I was here at number 15 out of 16. No point in stopping now. Just a minor gripe. I really dislike the progress of corruption on Wander in the remake, as it's barely noticeable. Well, I actually dislike the human character models as a whole, but that's not important here. One nice detail, though, is that you can see the darkness under his skin grow from his neck to his head, from his wrists to his hands. After we have defeated the 16th and final Colossus, we see Wander has been corrupted by Dormin's essence he absorbed after each victory. His skin is ghostly white, as if drained of blood, which itself has been replaced by darkness. His eyes shine the same magical glow of the Colossus he fell, and now horns grow from his head. Wander seems to barely be able to walk, and only groans leave his mouth. The price to revive Mono was to be the new host of Dormin, and it's so painful to see what he has become. To pull from the art book, the black bands that pierce Wander's body after defeating a Colossus are symbolic of Dormin's freed power entering Wander. The black shapes surrounding Wander are part of Dormin. The Colossus were the bone and muscle that formed their body, and those shadows were the blood that flowed within it. The form of Dormin we see in the ending was composed from the features of all 16 Colossus we fought. If the original plan of 48 Colossus or the other 8 that were ultimately cut were to have made their way into the final product, this form of Dormin would have had a different appearance. Thus, the truth is that the Colossus and Dormin are one and the same. The art book also mentions that the Colossus were based off the idols found within the Shrine of Worship, and the player can infer this based on the defeat of a Colossus is also the destruction of its corresponding idol in the shrine. It's safe to say that each idol represents a different facet or power of Dormin, but any further details is unexplained and leaves us with a murky sense on this ancient, nearly forgotten religion. It is easy to focus on the Colossus. After all, they are the centerpieces, and figuring out how to defeat them is the core gameplay. However, I think too many analysis videos focus on the Colossus more than the actual story and characters. I'm sure some viewers have caught on to how I've been referring to the Colossus. Many Western fans have adopted names that popped up online shortly after the game released in the mid-2000s. I believe it was someone on a PlayStation message board that said they overheard these names in a Japanese interview, but this turns out to be untrue. Once more, official sources have stated that the Colossus do not have names. They were never given names. They did have nicknames for development purposes, though. Some of them are cool, like Poseidon, Leo, Cerberus. You got the Minotaur brothers. But then you have ones like Bird, Gecko, and Snake. The final Colossus was referred to as Evis, after Elvis Presley. I'm not joking. You know, it's funny how no one talks about Elvis Presley's connection to this game. Fans bestowing names upon the Colossus to the point that many people think they are official names. It's a problem. I understand wanting to refer to the Colossus via means other than first, second, third, and so forth, but by doing so is unintentionally altering the narrative constructed by Ueda. It places a false character and importance on them, as well as a misunderstanding of their relationship to Dormin. The game is referred to as Shadow of the Colossus in English, but it's a Japanese game where its true title is Wander and the Colossus. This is Wander's story. We play as him. It is his motives that drive this narrative. Thus, I believe the theme of Zankokse that Ueda wanted to convey had little to do with the Colossus. After defeating the fifth Colossus, you can start to hear Mono's voice prior to awakening at the Shrine of Worship. The words she speaks are not subtitled, leaving the player unable to comprehend Mono. But the art book does state that she is begging Wander to stop. Nothing further in detail is mentioned, but let's recall what happens shortly before we can hear her. Wander is pierced by tendrils that are a fragment of Dormine, and over the course of the game, it slowly brings a physical change to him. Mono is begging Wander to stop as she cannot bear to see what is happening to him for her sake. You see, it isn't what you do to the Colossus that is wrong, but ultimately, what you are doing to yourself. Ueda was trying to tell a Beauty and the Beast story with a twist of the beast being born from his love of beauty. This leads into what was an alternate ending for the game that was cut. While I'm not particularly fond of analysis on content that was removed or changed, the core element to this ending is still present in the final version. This ending was planned to be unlocked if the player had an Ico save file on their memory card. Ueda thought this would be unfair for players who didn't play his first title, and while they did mull over adding a side quest to unlock it, they chose to just not include it. Bear in mind, this game was being developed when remaster editions of games were rare, and the idea of digitally purchasing console games was a few years away. Also, YouTube launched when the game was in the final stages of development, and the idea of people watching full games online, let alone watching people's reactions to those games and making a career off of that, where you can buy a nearly $3 million home in LA, was, well, it was unthinkable.
What is the Shadow of Colossus?
The alternate ending starts the same, with Emon and his men arriving at the Shrine of Worship to see the final idol crumble. It takes a different turn once they realize Wander has appeared behind them. Wander's transformation was originally planned for him to grow larger in size, take on a more monstrous appearance, opposed to the more gradual changes we wind up seeing. As they are about to put Wander out of his misery, Mono rises. Emon commands his men to kill her instead, but the sword hits a magical barrier around her and goes flying, and yes, I see that is similar to how the Queen's magic works in Ico, and yes, I still think it's a terrible theory. Don't know what I'm talking about? Please go watch my video on that theory. It's a bad theory. That's my take. Emon and his men then flee from the shrine as the forbidden ritual was complete. Wander approaches Mono, but she is blind and cannot see him. It isn't until she touches his face that she realizes it's him and that he's changed. The two later ride off on Agro into the sunset to live happily ever after. The end. Whenever I've told people about this ending, they seem to prefer the one we got, and I do as well. However, Ueda expressed regret removing it from the game, and based off interviews I've come across, he still seems to be a tad bit dissatisfied with the final product. This is pure speculation on my part, but I think this is because he realized after player feedback and interviews he's done, the story he wanted to tell didn't quite land. Ueda's goal was to have the player feel a bond towards Mono, similar to how those who had played Ico did with Yorda. But most players winded up being more connected with Agro. I don't blame those players. Mono, unfortunately, is barely a character, and we spend so much time with Agro, who even plays an important role in fighting some of the Colossus. Of course, this is what would later spur Ueda to make The Last Guardian, and despite how troubled and lengthy the development for that title was, I and many other players were truly moved by the bond we formed with Trico. I'm sure he is quite glad that many players love Shadow of the Colossus, but when you're a creator, if what your intentions were doesn't quite land, you may still be disappointed regardless of the adoration and praise. At the start of 2021, Gen Design's website gave us a tease of his next title. We see what appears to be the next protagonist wearing gear that evokes a post-apocalyptic feel as he stands next to what looks to be a large robot with plant life growing on it. I get a very Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind vibe from this. Another image teased on his next title is of a mysterious woman bathed in light, sitting on a familiar altar as her gaze points towards what looks like a large ape-like hand in the shadows. The title of this image is revealed in the website source code as Beauty and the Beast. Well, if you fail the first time, then try again. We're told at the beginning that what Wander is embarking on is to break an extreme taboo, and yet despite that, the people who sealed Dormion's power left the entrance to the Forbidden Lands intact. The artbook states that the ancient land is a place that should be detested, but the humans need it. If they destroyed the bridge and completely sealed away the land at the start, none of the events of the game would have happened. But it still exists for that reason. Sacrifices and idolatry are ridiculous, aren't they? I think that just because they're ancient customs, they're passed down through the generations. There's no justifiable reason for them. Is it truly cruel of Wander, and by extension us, the player, to be killing the Colossus? Is it not also cruel for a deity to be defied and defiled for knowledge they bear that humans find detestable but cannot fully abandon and forget? What of Ammon and the others who deemed Mono's fate to be cursed? How does one decide a young woman must be sacrificed to prevent a possibility? A woman robbed of her humanity that her beloved chooses to lose his in order to restore hers. It seems as though sacrificing her has done nothing more than to make sure her cursed fate does become true. Why is Ammon just and Wander wrongful? This is Zankokse, the need to follow tradition despite the cruelty of those traditions. That is how it has been, how it should always be, and never questioned. And thus ends part 1 of my take on Shadow of the Colossus. I realize that I've been working on this far longer than I would have liked. I still have more to say, so as I mentioned before, the next part will be addressing my frustrations with the online discussion I often come across on this game. And it's not all bad. There's some things the fanbase came up with that I kinda like, actually. Well, when was the first time you played Shadow of the Colossus, and did you feel bad or indifferent on defeating them? What are your thoughts on Ueda's other titles? What are you hoping to see in his next game? Please let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching. You've been a doll.